Hey everyone, and welcome. Today, we're going to break down a fascinating sermon that gets into a topic that's both deeply personal and often pretty charged: patriotism. But we're looking at it through a very specific lens, exploring the spiritual side of loving and defending your homeland from an Islamic point of view. So here's our game plan for this explainer. We're going to start with that universal feeling of what home means, then see how that's reflected in religious tradition, and from there, we'll dive into the really deep theological questions, like what it truly means to defend that home. You know, what's really interesting is that the sermon doesn't kick off with some heavy theological doctrine. Nope. It starts with something we can all relate to. The argument is that loving your homeland isn't just a man-made idea, but a gut instinct, a basic impulse that all living creatures share. To really drive this point home, the sermon brings in this quote from the classical scholar Al-Azma'i. It frames this love for your homeland not as a political stance, but as something as fundamental and powerful as an animal's instinct to get back to its nest. The sermon really builds on this, suggesting that this powerful pull towards home is actually a sign that a person is in a natural, healthy state. It's a pretty direct shot at anyone who might dismiss patriotism or call the homeland just a handful of rotten soil. Instead, this love is painted as something pure and totally instinctual. All right, so we've established this natural, primal instinct. But how does that connect to faith? Well, to answer that, the sermon points straight to the life of the Prophet Muhammad as the key example, showing his deep personal connection to his home. And this right here, this is a huge moment. Imagine being forced into exile from your hometown, Mecca. His words just drip with this profound attachment. He's not just leaving a place on a map, he's being torn away from a core part of his identity. And it wasn't just a one-off thing. This timeline shows how this connection was woven through his entire life. You see it in his sadness when leaving Mecca, in his prayer to love his new home, Medina, and even years later in the way he'd literally spur his horse on faster, just at the sight of the city's landmarks. He'd even ask travelers for news about Mecca. The point the sermon is making is clear. This isn't just nostalgia. It's establishing that loving your country is a totally valid, even celebrated feeling within the faith. Okay, and this brings us to the absolute core of the sermon. This is where that emotional idea of patriotism slams right into a profound religious concept: martyrdom. So is defending your nation an act that can earn you that sacred honor? The speaker just lays the question right out there, shifting us from emotion and history to a really complex theological breakdown. And as we're about to see, the answer isn't a simple yes or no. It really depends. So, to get to the answer, the first thing the sermon does is draw a really important line in the sand. It basically says, look, people from all walks of life, any religion, no religion at all, will fight and die for their country. That's a universal human thing. But for that exact same act to have religious meaning in Islam, to even be in the conversation about martyrdom, there are some very specific boxes you have to check. So what are those conditions? What are those boxes you have to check? This next part is really the theological heart of the entire sermon, where it lays out the step-by-step argument for when defending your homeland is considered a sacred act. Okay, so it boils down to these three core conditions. 1, the defender has to be a Muslim. 2, the homeland has to be considered an Islamic one. Now, from this theological perspective, those first two are pretty straightforward. But it's this third point, the intention, or niyyah, behind the action, that's the real game changer. It's all about why you're doing it. And to show just how critical this idea of intention is, the sermon pulls out this famous story from the Hadith. You've got 3 guys, all fighting on the same side, but for totally different reasons. One wants to look brave, another is all about tribal loyalty, and the third just wants to show off. The question forces you to look past the action itself and deep into the motivation. And boom, here's the answer, straight from the Prophet. It is crystal clear. It's not about how brave you are or how loyal you are. In a religious sense, what elevates the act is the ultimate goal. The only one on God's path is the one fighting with the intention of making God's word supreme. Now, what does making God's word supreme actually mean here? The sermon is quick to clarify. It's not talking about jihad al-talib, an offensive war to spread the faith. No, the focus is on jihad al-daf, which is purely defensive. In this view, protecting an existing Islamic society from an outside threat is a way of upholding God's word within that community. But here's where it gets really interesting. The sermon argues that this whole idea of defense isn't just for soldiers on the front lines. It expands the concept to include everyday civilians, arguing they have a huge role to play in protecting the nation too. So national defense becomes this multi-layered effort. According to this perspective, it's about making the country stronger from the inside out. That means unifying behind your leaders, not spreading rumors that cause chaos, raising strong families, and yes, even praying for the nation's success. It's all part of the same big picture of defense. And this is where it gets very modern. The sermon points to a specific contemporary challenge, arguing that public debate itself can be a kind of battlefield. It suggests that voices questioning military readiness during times of threat, even for what seem like good economic reasons, can actually be a tactic used by adversaries to weaken a nation's resolve from the inside. To wrap things up, the sermon, which was originally delivered in Egypt, uses this really powerful and beautiful allegory from the Quran. It takes a verse about nature and applies it directly to the country's unique situation. And here's the metaphor. The speaker says God's protection of Egypt is subtle and perfectly tailored. Just as the country is spared destructive local rainstorms and instead receives the life-giving Nile River from far away, its protection is seen as a unique blessing. It's something, he argues, that requires gratitude and awareness from its people. And so, in the end, we're left with this big idea to think about. What happens when love of country is seen not just as a natural instinct, but as a potential act of faith? Well, it changes the meaning of everything you do in its service, from the soldier on the border to the citizen fostering unity at home. It reframes civic duty as a path to a much higher purpose.